Oh, hello there. Yes, well, thank God for Friday and all those other restaurants that you probably don't go to. Anyway, yeah, today is the day after the government has sort of published its vague nod towards teaching kids, or not teaching kids specifically about gender or not about gender in schools. And I did like the way that for most of yesterday, basically Maya and Helen Joyce from Sex Matters, yeah, that huge organisation of both of them, were invited on to talk about issues of education, which of course they're not educators. Yeah, because they're always invited on, because that's who you get to talk to. You get to talk to a Conservative MP and Helen, and that's it. Okay, now I'm actually a teacher, and this will have a direct bearing on how I work with certain of my pupils for blindingly obvious reasons. But what I want to talk about today, because that's merely guidance, which is going to hack them off, and it's very, very nebulous, which I'd like to point out, which will also hack them off. But leaving that aside, today I wanted to turn to the gorgeous and pouting Patrick Christie, just to see where this particular moral panic will go next, because after they've won with the Cass report and they've won with the government's guidance in schools, they will need to win yet again, with the notion that the perverts are after our kids in schools. You see, that's what a moral panic is. You just keep it going for as long as you can do, because after all, that's the business that GB News are in. Anyway, let's have a look at this, and I'll stop and commentate in my most usual annoying style. Yes, well, here he is, looking very serious. Now, the tagline for this is "Get your hard drive checked." Patrick Christie's grills weird, in inverted commas, unions for sex education stance. I think they don't mean unions as in sex. I think they mean trade unions, because as we well know, trade unions in the education sector are going to be very, very, very weird, and they are going to want to get their hard drive checked, because using the Glinner playbook, what this is about, of course, is that people that want to teach children about life have nefarious things going on, and there's a sinister agenda. So if you want to teach children to become more sexually aware and to avoid some of the pratfalls that they might fall down with sexual predators, that's a bad thing, I think. Yes, anyway, you may notice that he uses Pink Floyd, and I'll have to say to Patrick that some of us were doing that days ago, mate, so keep up.
Anybody who wants to teach children under the age of 9 years old about sex needs to have their hard drive checked. Schools in England will be banned from teaching sex education to children under 9 in new government guidance expected to be published tomorrow. Good. Why on earth did teachers even want to do that in the first place?
Right, okay, and yes, this is from about 24 hours ago, but why did teachers want to do that in the first place? I mean, it's a tricky question that almost anyone with a brain can answer, obviously, because it's a statutory requirement under the national curriculum. Patrick. End of. Okay, mate, and we have had, one of those governments that you quite like for the last 15 years, so that's that. So if we're going to point fingers about bad people doing bad things, then that might get problematic, I suppose. Yes, why on earth would people want to do that? Why would teachers who have a working knowledge of children and their psychosexual development want to do that? Think Piaget and all those other, philosophers and writers. Well, it's probably because being educated about the world is a good thing, Patrick. And almost everybody that basically isn't a rabid evangelical preacher or a member of the Republican Party or both, or Miriam Gapes or Kemi Badenoch, knows full well that if you start to talk to children about these issues from an early age, it doesn't have to be sexualized, but if you start doing it at an early age, it reaps real benefits. Most people from the last few decades who've talked about sex education in schools recognise how good it is. Most people who talk about sex education in the decades when I was growing up, or indeed probably around about the time that Patrick was very small, recognise it was very bad. And the reason why it was bad compared to now when it's good is because we talk to children in a relevant way about relevant issues. Yes, age of 9, you may notice. And the government had to pin it at 9. I think this government probably wanted to, basically, if they could have done, made it a lot older. But you can't, because 9 is when young women are likely or may well start menstruating, which for those of the uninformed amongst us, which I think Patrick might be one of, is when young women become increasingly vulnerable for a number of different reasons to abusive men. Not trans men, not trans individuals. I'm not saying that. I'm not even saying Tory MPs, although they are a particular cohort that will prey on young people. But just generally because they're at serious risk of pregnancy. Let's move on.
Schools will also be banned from teaching kids under 9 about gender identity. Now, I'm sorry, but in my view, there are a lot of people out there who are absolutely desperate to sexualise kids. And they want to use the banner of LGBTQ plus IA, whatever, the rainbow flag, happy, clappy inclusivity, in order to be able to do that.
Yes, you see, because if you say, oh, there are people out there that want to sexually abuse children, then the good way of doing that is to instantaneously lump it in with all people who aren't cis heterosexuals. That's how you do that, okay? You know, notice that it's instantaneous, and which neatly, for someone of a delicate old age like me, takes me right the way back to the 1980s, because after all, you can't see two men on EastEnders kissing because it will sexualise children and turn them gay, and when that is a bad thing. We know what they're like. Patrick knows what theirs like in his book. Yeah, in his book. I don't know what book that is because it isn't an educational tool, is it? No, we'll probably come on to books, but let's go.
Why are teaching unions desperate to have conversations with your child about their private parts?
Right, okay. Teaching unions aren't desperate, actually. That's not the job of teaching unions. Teaching unions are there to protect their members. What Patrick here is failing to, I think, understand is that there are teachers who do teaching things, and there are their worker representatives who are the teaching unions. I would have thought at his age he would have got his head around that, but apparently that's too hard. Anyway, why do they want to talk about your child's private parts? Because your child probably has lots of questions at about age 9, particularly if they're female and about to menstruate, and some of their friends are, about what exactly is going on. Now, you can argue, if you like, very, very much, if you want to, that if you don't say anything to children about these things, that magically that will make them happier. And again, I will suggest strongly that pretty much every single study on an academic and educational level that you will find since the Second World War will argue the other. The people that argue that that's a bad thing are your evangelical Christians, your Muslims, et al. And people like Patrick Christie, who now solidly represent that kind of Christio-fascist viewpoint of the world, right? Okay, you can't be told about things because I have decided. And Patrick, I will point out to you, is not somebody I think who's been in a school for quite a while. Anyway.
Do you not think that's a bit weird? There are numerous cases of sexuality being forced onto children. A Christian mother took one primary school to court after her 4-year-old, was forced to take part in a gay pride parade.
Right, okay, and this is where we get into the spurious notion, enormously good part of a moral panic, of false accusations. So I remember this story when it came out. The child wasn't forced to take part in anything. The school was doing stuff in and around LGBT issues, and the child was at the school. The claim was never actually substantiated. Yeah? And again, think about this, okay? The notion that if you show a child a rainbow flag at 4, they will become damaged by it. It's a very intriguing notion. I always use the analogy of homeopathy. This idea that if you put some witch hazel in a bottle of water and water it down and down and down, then the water will remember it's witch hazel. And the child, having seen a rainbow flag when they're 4, will years later decide that they're gay. That's apparently the way that it works. It's sexuality homeopathy. Stunning the way that it works.
In Hull, parents pulled their child out of a nursery because their young child was shown a book that included a grandfather dressed in BDSM gear with a spiked dog collar and everything.
Yes, and that enabled Patrick to really slobber when that particular story came out. There's a character in that book that is in leather gear in the background. And again, you have to imagine, right, okay, that a child will look at that book and pick out that particular image, the one that Patrick finds alluring, probably, and therefore be affected by that. He said it was, what was it? He said it was gay bondage porn for the kids. And you may notice this is a book about teaching children about what the adult world is like. Now, in the adult world, as Patrick well knows, there are some people who aren't entirely heterosexual. He knows this to be true because there are various people that used to work, for example, at GB News before they got fired, like Dan Wootton, who were gay. So I'm sure he's aware of that. So we are once again talking about teaching children about the realities of the world. Lots of kids in schools will have parents who aren't entirely heterosexual. Shall we pretend to those children that that reality doesn't exist? Well, maybe. Because after all, during Section 28, we know how well that worked, and nobody was gay during the years when Section 28 was in operation in schools. Obviously. Let's move on.
It's not just schools, though. A local library came up with the idea of encouraging children to read by hiring, and apologies in advance for this, Rainbow Dildo Butt Monkey to perform for young kids. Now, if you don't believe me...
No, I do believe you, Patrick. I do like the way that you're trying to keep a straight face there. Yes, another classic one for your moral panics is to get a worst-case scenario. And yes, got to admit that Enfield Library did make a bit of a boob with that. But this has nothing to do with schools, you notice. This has nothing to do with teaching unions. It has nothing to do with me and what I'm going to do with my students tomorrow. That's a library, Patrick, okay? And I know libraries have books, and I know schools have books, but they are two separate institutions. Usually, I know schools have libraries, but you notice the way that it doesn't matter, really. We are suddenly into the demonising of anyone who isn't heterosexual because they are inherently dangerous, because at heart, what they want to do is turn up at your local library looking like this particular individual. Yes, maybe a mistake.
Here is the offending creature. They hired that to come and talk to young children about books. Yeah, why? Seriously, why? We've had primary school teachers ignore government guidance that parents should be informed if their child starts saying that they want to change gender.
Okay, and this is a brilliant circular argument here. Okay, now the government brings out suggested guidance, which is suggested guidance. It isn't statutory and therefore doesn't have to be obeyed. But because of that, right, yeah, GB News, the organisation he works for, which he's therefore quoting, says that schools will ignore it. Yes? Which isn't actually necessarily what happened. But you'll notice the way that that's perfect in that the evidence for this going on is stuff that we've badly reported. And the whole thing about letting pupils switch gender without the parents' knowledge sounds serious until you actually, like a professional, like a teacher, think about safeguarding. Some kids have parents that aren't perfect, Patrick, and I know in the GB News universe, that is sacrosanct. The idea that parents always know best, but I don't want to shock you, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can't understand the difference between a school and a library. And sometimes they don't understand how the books in the library affect people as well.
One school trust, which comprises several Church of England primary schools, has advised teachers to help young girls use breast binders when out on school trips and let students sleep in bedrooms matching their chosen gender identity. You've got
Right, okay, and yes, that was a particular group of primary school children, and that was blown very much out of proportion. You can look this stuff up for yourself, because once you actually go past the immediate throttling headlines, you realise that it was basically some parents were asking whether or not their kids, who were prepubescent, could share rooms, and the answer was yes. Why? Because they're prepubescent. And in Patrick Christie's world, he wants to maintain the innocence of childhood, whilst at the same time suggesting in this that prepubescent children are sexual predators, which is a bit weird, just to use his own analogy, and it appears that he's the one a little bit obsessed by children's genitalia. Let's move on.
Resources like this available online. Teach children about pride in an early years setting. They can do rainbow finger paintings. Why? Why is it?
Yes, why would they do rainbow finger painting? It's dreadful, isn't it? Because it's a well-known fact that 98.6% of the people that are now identify as lesbians were affected by rainbow paints. This is almost an argument for like banning painting sets in W.H. Smith. After all, they do come in yellows and reds and pinks and blues, don't they? Imagine giving that to a child. How warped are these people with their obsession with colours? Astounding. And yeah, you notice what he says, readily available on the internet. Yeah, there are guidance that's given out to adults, okay? I've got various books about pedagogy at home, okay? I don't use them as teaching materials. They are the two different things. And perhaps, again, if Patrick could move and actually, well, no, of course not. It's not his job, is it? But think about that, okay? All right? So often I see these stories where somebody has read some stuff that is a training material that's written for the elucidation and edification of adults, and they think that magically that document is going to be given to 3-year-olds to be discussed. It's not the way it works.
It's important to talk to 4- or 5-year-olds about their sexuality. Now, I found the reaction to this from teaching unions quite baffling, okay? So this new desire for the government to just push back on this a little bit and say, whoa, hold your horses, let's wait till the kids are a bit older. So Paul Whiteman is apparently the General Secretary at Schools Leaders Union, the NAHT, and he said, if what has been leaked is accurate, the government must provide the evidence which unequivocally shows that such age limits will improve the support, protection and safeguarding of children and young people. No, Paul.
Yes, Paul. You see, Patrick, that's somebody who's a professional asking for evidence rather than merely a group of bigoted people, yourself included, who just demand things. Oh, no, you can't talk to children about sex. What, you mean people under the age of 18? Yes. Well, why? Because we demand it. Well, on what basis? Well, it's protecting children. Can you show me any evidence of that? No, but I'm going to get blindingly angry if you demand it. Yeah, evidence-based work is what everybody should do. And one might argue the same thing about journalism. But again, with our whole Cohen moral panics and folk devils, that's not what this is about. This is about pushing, once again, very much the station's agenda, which is to demonise certain groups of people because it beats saying anything about anything else. And you will notice that most of this stuff isn't about trans people. We've now very much solidly moved on to all those nasty gays and lesbians and bisexuals and the rest, because you know what they're like.
With respect, mate, I think you have to provide the evidence that people like you telling a 7-year-old about tampons, willies and 72 genders has some kind of benefit.
Right, okay. Apart from the 72 genders, which everyone has very widely debunked, the Education Secretary got in trouble yesterday because she couldn't actually cite any evidence for that particular one, or indeed any of the other of her claims. Yes. But what Patrick is doing here is neatly saying, oh, you have to provide the evidence. Well, I certainly could do that. There's vast numbers of studies in and around the value of modern sex education in schools. It's one of the reasons why we have, as I pointed out, I think yesterday, very, very much lower levels of teenage pregnancies. compared to what it was 30 years ago. There's a reason for that. And a big part of that is the stuff that kids are taught in school, because it's done extremely well and extremely age appropriately. But, of course, that will mean that Patrick cannot get cross about these things. Yeah? So what he's going to get cross is about things that he's invented in his own head. And there is a word for people like that, and they often are obsessed with genitalia. But let's move on.
It's not bigoted, homophobic, transphobic or outdated to think that children under the age of 9 should just be treated like children.
Okay. Not convinced about that. Anyway, yes, it isn't bigoted to think that. Of course not. However, if you demand that people that know better than you do that simply because you think it's right, then it is. Yes, indeed. Well, there you have it. You can see there. To keep this moral panic going and avoid talking about real things, we're really going to go for all the queer people across the board. Don't like being called queer. I'm a gay man who's 72. Okay, mate. Yeah, good. I'll come for you as well. After all, they know what you like. Why are you so heavily invested in this, as Glenna might say? Yes, anyway, the beauties, the joys of a moral panic. You can just simply steer it any way you want to, and you can froth at the mouth and be indignant about it as well, because you, after all, are the moral guardians of our society. Yes, I have my doubts. Anyway, do have a lovely weekend if you can do. Do enjoy